not working. There we go. Okay, so I recorded something that was an introduction, kind of pre-Byzantine era thing. And for some reason, before I went to record that, the last several slides didn't save, so it was missing some of the information at the end. So I'm going to go through and re-record it, and maybe try to just do all of Byzantium in one recording. So we'll see how that goes. So if you're in my Art History 1 class, you should have already watched all of the lectures about Rome, and now we're going to get into a new segment on the Byzantine. So as you know, at this point, if you're in my class, or if you have watched multiple of these videos that I do about art history, I generally start off by asking you what you know about whatever the topic is. And oftentimes people know a few things about like the Roman Empire or Egypt or Greece or something like this. But a lot of times people just sort of stare blankly at me in my seated sections when I ask them what they know about the Byzantine. It's not maybe as well known of a topic as some of the other ones that we cover in Art History 1. So one of the little kind of clues I put over here is, what about Constantinople? Because if you've watched all of our lectures on Rome, you know that the last kind of Roman emperor before the fall of Rome that we talked about last time was Constantine, right? And so when he takes over, one of the things that he does is he moves the head of the Roman Empire to Constantinople in the east. So Byzantine and this era kind of begins with Constantine and with this move east. So we're going to do a little bit of review in terms of history, and then kind of talk about what's going on. So you've seen this map before. We looked at this map in the first lecture I did on Rome, kind of talking about what we think of as the classical ancient Roman Empire stops, basically, at this point. So, okay, let me kind of review just a little bit so we have an idea of where we are. So we have Diocletian in 298 CE, we're in the current era now, establishes what's called a Tetrarchy. So this is a rule by 4, okay? So he splits up the Roman Empire into 4 parts. And it works, kind of. It works until about 305. So for about 8 years, it kind of works. Then Constantine I, his dad was one of the 4 rulers. He takes control of the whole thing. So in 312, he sort of starts making a play a little earlier than that. And then in 312, Constantine takes over the entire thing. No more Tetrarchy, no more rule by 4, just rule by Constantine. And there are a couple really important things that he changes sort of immediately. So one of the things he does is he attributes his victory in taking control of the Roman Empire to the Christian God. So he had this symbol on his helmet and shield called the Christogram, or the Chi Rho. So the letters Chi, which looks like an X, and then the letter Rho, which kind of looks like a P, are the first 2 letters of the word Christ in Greek. And so Constantine believes that because he put these things on some of the helmet and things that he wore into battle, that's part of why he was able to be victorious and win. At this time, Christianity is a new religion, and it is illegal in the Roman Empire. So it's illegal to be a practicing Christian, and Christians are persecuted at this time. Constantine signed something called the Edict of Milan, and that ends the persecution of Christians. That makes it's no longer illegal to be Christian in the Roman Empire. So that's really important, because the Christianity is hugely impactful in Western culture from here on out, basically. So in our class, our survey of Art History 1, from this point forward, the Christian church becomes a major patron, and we see a huge influence in the subject matter, in art and in architecture in Europe from here on out. So it's kind of that's a really big deal. The other thing he does is he moves the capital from Rome, which you can see on your map here, which is in modern or contemporary Italy, and he moves it all the way east over to Constantinople, which is in what we contemporarily call Turkey. And so he founds Constantinople in 330. Right before that, in 325, there's a council that meets called the Council of Nicaea. They write the Nicene Creed. And this does a lot of things. We'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about the iconography of Christ and Christian artifacts and artworks in the early Christianity. But one of the other things it does is it sort of it makes Christianity kind of the de facto religion of the empire. It's not like the only religion, it's not binding, it's not illegal to have other religions at this point, but it does kind of become the de facto religion. And then he moves the seat of Rome to Constantinople. This is a big transition. So this is kind of the transition from the ancient world to what we call the medieval world. Constantine builds a lot of things. He builds a lot of things in Rome. He builds baths, roads, a forum, a basilica, an arch. But he's also the patron of the first churches. So we start seeing construction of this new kind of structure, which is a church, which takes some notes from Roman temples, but also has influence from other places. Okay, so one of the things that we see, so when Constantine makes the capital Constantinople instead of Rome in 330, he builds this on the site of an ancient place called Byzantium. So that's where we get this word Byzantine or Byzantium from. That was the previous civilization where Constantinople is. And so then after Constantine, we have Theodosius I. He succeeds Constantine, and he splits the empire in half. So this is when we see this big split under Emperor Theodosius, and he makes Arcadius, after him, becomes the emperor of the East, and he is seated in Constantinople. And then we have Honorius, who is the emperor in the West, and he moves the capital around a little bit. So he starts with the capital in Rome, right? Then he moves it up to Milan, and then he moves it to Ravenna after Rome is sacked in 410. So lots of people are attacking Rome because they see, since Constantine moved the capital, they see this as an opportunity. It seems like Rome itself, the city, is kind of weakened, is the kind of view. Okay, so the western half of the empire kind of returns to these warring kingdoms. It's not super stable. The eastern half has this really long history of its own. Constantinople becomes the new Rome, and it reigns for 1,000 years of stability. So that's a pretty long-standing empire. The last emperor, Constantine the 11th, dies in 1453, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's when the Ottoman Turks take over. So the Eastern Christian Roman Empire is sometimes called Byzantium or the Byzantine era, but that's what we call it as art historians, right? But the emperors at the time did not call themselves Byzantine. That was not a word that they used. They called themselves Romans, and they really believed that they, the eastern half of the empire, were the true Roman Empire. It's interesting because they are no longer in Rome, so that's kind of strange. And the other interesting thing is in the Roman Empire, the language is Latin, right? In Constantinople and the eastern half of the empire, they don't speak Latin, they speak Greek. So some kind of strange things, them thinking of themselves as the true Roman Empire when they have these really fundamental aspects of Roman history that are not part of them. The location in Rome, the language Latin. Byzantium Christianizes the Slavic Balkans and Russia. This is where we get the Orthodox Christian religion. The Eastern Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox religions come out of this point. These are kind of denominations of Christianity that split off, whereas in the West we have the rise of Catholicism, right? After the collapse in 1453, the Ottoman Empire rises. We generally think of Early Byzantine from 324 to 726. Then we have Middle Byzantine, and then we have Late Byzantine. And I will talk about all that in a minute, but first I want to go into late antiquity and what I kind of think of as pre-Byzantine. It's also sometimes categorized just as really early Byzantine work, but there are a few developments that I think are really important that happen at this time, particularly in the West, that lead into what we know of as the Byzantine era and what kind of its hallmarks are. So I just want to go through this, and again, if you watched that other recorded video, I go into some of this, but you may notice at the end I don't actually talk about illuminated manuscripts or different portrayals of Christ very much, and that's because I didn't realize the end of my slideshow had not saved. So I intended for that to go through illuminated manuscripts and then stop and then start a new lecture with early Byzantine, but I'm just going to put them together now and kind of pick up the slack that was left off there. Okay, so these are important things that I want us to talk about. The Basilica becoming an architectural plan for churches instead of administrative buildings, the central plan church, what's going on in Ravenna when the capital of the Western Roman Empire is moved to Ravenna, mosaics in general, their process, how they're used, why they're important in this era, the way Christ is represented, kind of the iconography of Christ in the early days of the religion, and then illuminated manuscripts. So these are kind of 6 things that really set the ball rolling and get us into what we know as Byzantium. So let's start with this idea of the Basilica. So if you recall from my lectures in the ancient Roman art and architecture, the word basilica comes from there, and the word basilica meant the big administrative building that would be, it was almost always connected to the forum. So the forum's like an outdoor public meeting space. The basilica would be almost like a city hall or a town hall where people could come in and talk to the administrators and governing people of their city. It was also kind of a meeting place, a public meeting place, a place for people to do orations and things like this. So it had this kind of layout where it had this big central naos, which is the Greek word, if you remember when we were talking about Greek temples, the central part was called the naos, N-A-O-S, and then there were kind of side aisles on there. So old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which if any of you have been to Rome, have been to the Vatican, St. Peter's is where the Pope is, right? That's the church that, the cathedral that the Pope is in charge of. If you've been there, you notice that it does not look like this anymore. It gets a pretty hefty redesign that happens later. So we have this heavy redesign. Kind of a famous guy named Michelangelo gets to redesign it, and then another famous sculptor from the Baroque period, Bernini, makes these big kind of circular colonnade arms that come off the front of it. So it looks quite different. Originally it looked like this. And let's take a look in here. So you can see the layout here. We now, instead of the naos, we have the nave. That's where the word nave comes from. It comes from the Greek word naos. We have the narthex. That's kind of the little entry area. We have that. In this case, we have double aisles on each side. Then we have an apse at the back and a little bit of a transept. And then there's this atrium, which is this sort of courtyard area in the front, which eventually we don't see. We also have the clerestory. We have a gabled roof. So this becomes this is what a basilica and administrative building kind of looked like before, and this becomes kind of the standard of the basilica form churches for early Christianity. Okay, that is not the only plan that we see for churches. By the way, what does this look like a little bit? It looks a little bit like a Roman temple, right? The layout is a little bit reminiscent of temples as well as their administrative basilica building. So it's not a total departure for something like this to be a place where people meet and maybe a place of worship. The other plan that becomes popular in the West is the central plan. So this also spreads to Greece eventually, but we definitely see it in Rome and in Ravenna. So this is Santa Costanza, which is in Rome. And here you have an idea that's more similar to another temple plan, which was the tholos, right? Which was the round kind of temple. So this is that round plan where you have the ambulatory instead of the aisle. You have the altar in the very middle, but you still have the narthex, the place where you go in. You still have your clerestory. So this also has a relationship to previous architecture and designs. Makes us think a little bit maybe of the Pantheon, for example. So we can see that relationship to existing buildings, and that makes it kind of comfortable, this transition into this new religion. Having structures that look sort of familiar to the people is helpful for the transition. The mosaic process, first of all, mosaic, we've talked about what this word means before. We talked about it when we were looking at Pompeii, and we were looking at images in mosaic that were on walls and floors, occasionally ceilings. So in the Byzantine era, mosaics can be made out of anything that's small, that's being kind of cemented or glued together to make a picture. In the Byzantine era, it's tessera, which are little tiles, little bitty glazed tiles, and they all have to be individually set in place. It's extremely tedious, and then laid out very specifically to form pictures, right, to show us images. And one of the things about this is in the Byzantine era, they did a lot of work with mosaic and gold. So they did a lot of gilding of mosaic so that you had these very reflective, shiny gold pieces. And if you get a chance to go to Ravenna or Istanbul or any of these places where there's lots of good mosaics, Venice, you can see that they're set in such a way that they kind of tilt at little angles. And I remember when I was an undergrad and was in Ravenna studying architectural history and art history, I remember thinking maybe it was they just settled that way over time because they were old, but that is not the case. They're very intentionally set at angles, especially the ones that are meant to be reflective of light, like the gold, to illuminate the work in a particular way, and so that when light hits it, it reflects off in a particular way to best showcase the imagery. So it's all very intentional, very tedious, tons and tons of labor. So just keep that in mind when we look at all these beautiful mosaic works from the Byzantine era, just thinking about setting each of those little individual pieces. Okay, so the next thing to talk about is the depictions of Christ. Because this becomes important, this becomes the subject matter for the Byzantine and beyond, through the Middle Ages, through the Romanesque and Gothic, through the rest of this class period, except for when we're talking about Islamic art next. So in my seated class, I start by having people tell me, and we make a big list on the board, of what they think of when I ask them to describe what does Jesus Christ look like. Okay, and so a lot of people say he has a beard, he has long hair. Some people talk about the crucifixion. Some people talk about him when he's a baby and he's sitting on Mary's lap. Some people talk about the stigmata, the holes in the hands and feet where he was nailed to the cross. Other people talk about different kinds of specific people he's shown with, like at the Last Supper where he has his 12 disciples. There's a lot of different things that we associate with the iconography of Jesus and how he's depicted. So one of the things people don't necessarily think about is that early on in a religion, people had to decide how deities were going to be portrayed, and so that they were recognizable and people knew who they were. So in the Byzantine era, there's a lot of kind of figuring out exactly how this Christ figure is going to be depicted so that people know who he is and can easily recognize him. Because remember, not a lot of people are literate at this time, and books are very rare, right? So pictures are really important. They're important for identification purposes. So this is very interesting. This is Christ as Sol Invictus. So this is the earliest depiction of Christ, and it's him being shown kind of in the guise of this Roman god Sol, the sun god, right? So he's in the chariot kind of driving the sun. We know it's Christ because he has this cruciform halo, so the kind of stylings of the cross in a halo around him. That's another thing people tend to mention is the halo. So this is sort of easing people into this idea. It's still, you could be persecuted for being Christian. There's some worry about early depictions of Christ. Maybe after Constantine it will be reversed and we'll be persecuted again. So this kind of gave people an out. They could be like, this isn't Christ, this is Sol, the sun god, you know? So it's kind of a little bit of a sneaky portrayal in that way, but it's also kind of really smart, because we're taking some iconography that already exists, that people are comfortable with, of the sun god, and superimposing the image of Christ in this role. So it's kind of a transitional piece, right, to make people more comfortable. So it's very interesting. Another thing that we see very early before this image, when Christianity is still illegal, we see the chi rho. So the chi, the X with the P shape, the rho, that becomes kind of a secret symbol of Christ. We also see the fish, you know, the little fish that some people put on the back of their cars now. That's an old symbol. That's from this time period as well. Okay, so now we're going to hop over to Ravenna. This was in Rome, and Old St. Peter's, and the mausoleum below St. Peter's. So this is in Ravenna. Ravenna is one of my favorite cities in the world. I would live in Ravenna. I love Ravenna. And this is a mausoleum of a woman named Galla Placidia. I show you the outside of the building because it's a very unassuming outside of a building. It doesn't look particularly interesting maybe from the outside. When you go inside, it's just, I mean, it's incredible. So the entire surface is mosaic. This is all mosaic. The windows are very, very thin alabaster, so stone that light permeates through slightly. And in here we see a couple of different depictions of Christ that become fairly popular. So one of them is Christ as the Good Shepherd, okay? And this one's interesting because we know that Christ as the Good Shepherd is something that is used for a long time. He's still depicted as a shepherd in contemporary depictions. He wasn't a literal shepherd, right? He was a carpenter, but it's symbolic, right, of the flock, like the Christians, his followers are his flock that he's protecting and tending to and leading. So this idea of him as a shepherd is pretty early. We see this depiction pretty early on. This one's a little different because he has no beard, so he is clean shaven, he looks younger. He's also holding as his shepherd staff a cross, so kind of very literal, saying, also, I'm Jesus, not just a shepherd. These sheep are really odd. They have long kind of like wolf tails. It's very strange. So we see this depiction of Christ as the Good Shepherd. This is a very early version of this depiction. And this is all done in this beautiful mosaic. Also, in the same structure, in the same mausoleum, we see that the chi rho is still there. And even though it's not kind of a code anymore, it's still embraced as the symbol, and we'll see it kind of throughout the Byzantine and the Middle Ages being the stand-in symbol for Christianity. So we have the chi, which is the X, the rho, which looks like a P. Here we see the addition of the alpha and the omega. So the alpha, that's the A, and the omega, which kind of looks like a W, that's the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. So the idea is that that's a symbol for sort of eternity, right? So this symbol we call the Christogram, and we see that throughout the Byzantine as a symbol for him. And then here's just some more depictions of the lovely inside of this mausoleum. Here is a coin from Constantine's era. One of you was writing about this coin in the discussion on the ancient Rome, Art of Ancient Rome discussion from the last module. So here we see the chi rho with the alpha and the omega on the back of a coin during Constantine's reign. So he really wanted this symbol to be affiliated with him as the first Christian emperor and as this person who's spreading Christianity throughout the empire. And he also used this as a way to kind of get the population used to the idea that this new religion is not illegal anymore and is not something to be persecuted or something to be hidden, right? Okay, So in the same vein of talking about the different ways Christ is depicted, so we have him as this good shepherd, we have the symbol, the Christogram and the fish, we have him as the sun god, soul. So this is another church in Ravenna called San Palinar Nuovo, and it has a lot of great mosaics. It's a really fascinating space. It has these processions of apostles and saints, and then up above, up on the top layer there, we see depictions from the life of Christ. They're a little hard to see in this image, but here's a few of them that I've pulled out. And one of the debates at the time in the Byzantine period is this idea of how Christ should be portrayed. Not just as a shepherd or as kind of a sun god up in the sky or things like this, but he's kind of tricky in a lot of ways. So he's the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he has these kind of three entities, three aspects to him, and there was a lot of debate at the Treaty of, at the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Trent. There are all these kind of debates about how Christ is going to be depicted and which aspect is the most important. So there were people who followed the Arian belief that the Father created the Son, therefore they were not equal. There were people who had the monophysite belief that Christ only had one nature, that he was divine, he was not human. And then there were people who believed that his humanity was his most important aspect, because that's where his empathy and pathos came from. A lot of those people are affiliated with the Gnostic religious beliefs. So there are all these different ideas. So this is early enough on that we see the artist here, and probably the patron of the church, has an idea about how Christ should be portrayed and what aspects are important. So here we have Christ up in the top as a baby sitting on Mary's lap. Then we see Christ as a kind of a younger man. So he has no beard, he has a little bit longer hair. Then we see him a little bit older, maybe. He has a little shorter hair, but he looks a little older, but he still doesn't have a beard. And then we have him fully mature with a beard and his long hair. So Christ ages in these mosaics all in the same church. And showing him age is basically endorsing the idea of his humanity. So when we think back to the portrayal of gods in Egyptian culture, for example, they stay very young, they look the same, they're sort of rigid, they always are sort of perfected. And that becomes a tradition throughout a lot of the classical and ancient periods, is that when you're depicting a god, they're going to be youthful and beautiful, right? And not change. And so this idea of a deity that ages is kind of a new idea, all right? So this was kind of a hot topic. So the way Christ is depicted, whether his humanity or his divinity is emphasized, or whether you somehow have a balance between both, which aspect of this God is more important, or are they equal, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit thing? These are all kind of important things that are being figured out in the arts platform. Okay, another thing in this kind of late antiquity, pre-Byzantine area that's important is the advent of illuminated manuscripts. So what's an illuminated manuscript? Well, in this instance, a manuscript is a book, basically, okay? And an illuminated manuscript is a book with pictures. You could switch out the word illuminated for the word illustrated, basically. So books start being produced more. We start seeing more books. Books are still rare, they're very valuable, and they're mostly produced at this time for religious purposes, though we'll look at a secular one when we get into the early Byzantine. And they are generally produced by scribes who live in monasteries, and they are generally, they're all handwritten, of course, and we start seeing these illustrations with them. So we have images depicting what's happening in the written narrative. And this leads to a couple of things that are kind of important. So one of them is certainly that we can spread this information and this knowledge more readily with books, with portable books. They're not being carved into stone or anything like this. Vellum is made out of skin out of like calf skin or sheep skin that's treated with a specific process. The other thing is a new material becomes really important. So we have tempera paint. And tempera paint is where we're using pigment crushed up in egg yolk. Egg yolk is used with it, and you have this kind of layering in of these thin layers of tempera paint on vellum, and that's how these are created. There's also gilding, there's also gold leaf attached. So they're these very precious things, and they become kind of a major art form. Let's look at another one. So here's one from the Rosado Gospels, and here you can see that the illustration is the dominant part of the page. You can also see that we're starting to lose things like the background and ideas about perspective. So we have some attempts at perspective and modeling, making things three-dimensional, but you'll notice the people do not cast shadows, neither do the animals or the structures. The perspective is somewhat off, and it's this sort of flattened, and it just gets flatter and flatter, kind of unrealistic sort of style, which becomes dominant in this time period. Okay, so now let's get into the Byzantine proper. So we're now getting into the early Byzantine, which I would categorize from about 324 through the Iconoclasm, which is in 726 under Emperor Leo the Third. Excuse me. Okay, in the early Byzantine, we have what's called the Golden Age of Byzantine art, and that's the Justinian period. So that's when Justinian is the emperor. So this is a little bit pre-Justinian. So sometimes when we're talking about early Byzantine art, things get categorized as Justinian or pre-Justinian, just so you're familiar with this. So this is the Archangel Michael, who's carved into this ivory piece. Ivory is very popular for luxury items and small arts luxury items at the time. It's very expensive, very precious. And part of that idea is this increased interest in having personal art objects that aren't just in, you know, temples or carved in friezes, but things that people could have in their homes and take with them. This becomes something of interest at this time. This is super interesting for a lot of reasons, this particular piece. The Archangel Michael, so there's lots of angels in the biblical texts. The archangels are special, they have names and more prominent roles. So the Archangel Michael becomes the patron saint of Byzantine emperors. So remember when we were talking about ancient Egypt, how Horus was the god that was affiliated with living pharaohs? It's sort of a similar idea. So if you know anything about Catholicism, or Eastern Orthodox, or Greek Orthodox, or I think Episcopalians have saints too. Any of these kind of religions that have this more traditional liturgy, saints play a big role. There's lots of saint days. You have your saint from your name day, that kind of thing. If you have a certain profession, certain saints are affiliated with that profession. Like Joseph is the patron saint of carpenters because he was a carpenter, that kind of thing. Stephen is the patron saint of hat makers. I don't know why those are the two examples that came to my head, but there are saints for kind of everything. Okay, there's Saint Gertrude, who's the patron saint of like cats and trivia. So she's basically my saint, I feel like. I'm not Catholic, but if I were, that would be my gal, you know? So anyway, saints kind of fill in this role, whereas in the ancient religions, you would pray to a specific god if you needed something. So you need a good harvest, you go and pray to Vesta. If you are going into war, you maybe go pray to Ares, that kind of thing. So saints kind of fill in this niche role that the previous religions that had multiple gods sort of filled in. So people still kind of wanted this guided prayer idea that they could focus on a specific entity. So this becomes very popular in the Middle Ages. But Archangel Michael is the patron saint of the emperors of the Byzantine Empire for a couple of different reasons. One of the main ones is that, just imagine this depiction as a woman instead of a man for a second. Who does it look like? What does it remind you of? The winged Nike? You're exactly right. So this was made kind of quite intentionally to resemble the winged Victory or the Nike, which if you think back to when we were talking about ancient Greece and we were talking about the, excuse me, the Acropolis and all the portrayals of the Nike there, it makes sense. So we have this familiar looking entity that is the personification of victory. So new empire, they want to be the victors, they want to be strong, so of course they want to pick someone to be their patron saint who kind of has this imagery that signals triumph, right? And he's holding the orb, which sometimes the Nike holds an orb showing victory over the world or something like this. This orb has a cross on it, so it's kind of the Christian world. And one of the other things that's interesting about this is the inscription at the top says, "Receive these gifts," which is something the Archangel Michael says when he's approaching the Virgin Mary. But it's also something that's an interesting emblem for the Byzantine Empire. So receive these gifts, and it seems almost like they're saying, go forth and conquer, and the areas you're conquering are your gifts, are sort of, it's almost like manifest destiny, like ordained, you're preordained by God to take this over. So it's this interesting kind of permission slip from above that they give themselves. Excuse me, I don't know what's wrong with me. Okay, this is the secular book that I wanted to tell you about, that I think is super fascinating. So this is the Vienna Dioscorides. So Dioscorides was a Greek physician, and he compiled an encyclopedia of medicinal herbs called the Materia Medica. And so this survived and then was copied. So this is a copy of this ancient Greek document. And what's interesting to me is that it's a secular book, first of all, where books are very valuable and precious at this time, and so they're almost entirely devoted to holy things, to religious texts. So this was considered important enough to copy it. And one of the things that I think is interesting is they copy it in the same style as the original illustrations. So it's in that classical style that's very interested in naturalism and very interested in things being realistic, which is not what the Byzantine style looks like at all. And why I like that this exists, first of all, I just think it's really cool. Second, it shows that the artists of the time were perfectly capable of working realistically and working in a naturalistic way, but they didn't because that was not the style of the time. So kind of a older perspective on this was that in the Byzantine, people kind of forgot how to draw, and that's why nothing looks realistic. But I think that this is evidence, along with many other things, that that isn't really the case. It's not that people lost the ability, it's that the stylistic preference changed. So I like this as an artifact of that. And it's just really cool. There's 498 illustrations in it. You can look up a ton of them online. They're lovely, super fascinating. Okay. This is a page in the book, that same book, that was not copied from the original Greek. This was the dedication page. So this book was copied and made as a gift to Annika Juliana. And so she is depicted in this dedication page between a personification of magnanimity and prudence, so personifications of virtues, basically. And she also has this figure kneeling at her feet, and that figure is supposed to represent gratitude from the arts. So she's the daughter of an emperor, Anicius Olybrius, who doesn't stay in power. He's an emperor in the West. He doesn't stay in power very long, but she's quite rich. She's, you know, the daughter of an emperor, and she uses her money to fund lots of arts. So she's a great patron of the arts, and so this was given in appreciation to her. One of the things that she does, I think is pretty interesting, is she funds this church in Constantinople that's built in 524, that's a domed church that is a very influential forerunner to probably the most famous thing from the Byzantine, which is Hajiya Sophia, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other thing that I like about this is it has that much more Byzantine, flattened, floating in space, unnatural kind of look. And so the same artist doing this and this is really interesting to me, and I think it's an interesting thing to look at and think about how why certain stylistic choices were made and the times they were made. I also like her as a figure. You've noticed this about me so far, probably. I like to point out women who are influential cultural figures. Okay, let's talk about my favorite emperor of the Byzantine era, and that's Justinian. So he's the one that we kind of call his reign the golden age of the Byzantine. He was a big patron of the arts, big patron of architecture, really important fella. So he's around from 527 to 565. He militaristically was very important. He, in terms of the history of the Byzantine Empire, he did a lot of important fighting and conquering. So he drove the Ostrogoths out of Italy. He had important generals help him with that. That was Belisarius and Narses were his big two generals who he sent off to do these things. He expelled the Vandals from Africa. He beat back the Bulgars and the Sasanians, who were attacking from the north and the east. He, in Constantinople, he put down the Nika revolt of 532, so he restores peace and order there through violent means, which is what a lot of these leaders do, as we've learned throughout history. So he's an important guy. So this is him being portrayed as the world conqueror, which after that list of things that he did, you kind of can probably see why that makes sense. This piece is also sometimes called the Barbarini Ivory. That's because it was in the same collection of works as the Barbarini Faun, which one of you in my class wrote about when we were talking about Hellenistic Greek work. It's carved out of ivory, and you can see it in the Louvre in Paris. I have seen it in person. It's kind of delightful. So it's an interesting, it's a really interesting piece because we have our central figure, Justinian, who's riding in on this horse, and he's riding in battle. And he has this barbarian in the back that he's defeated. And this kind of has a lot of important iconography symbolism for us. First of all, he's a leader on a horse. So equestrian portraits and statuary were really important during the Roman period, remember? Then we have this figure up in the corner flying down to him holding a palm. That's the winged Victory. That's Nike coming to bestow victory upon him. We also have this figure to the left in his own little panel who's in this traditional classical Roman armor. And he is bringing a statuette of the winged Victory to Justinian, so also saying that you're the true champion of Rome, basically. Down below, we have these people bringing in bountiful harvest items to him. We also have lions and tigers and elephants, oh my. So that signifies the bounty of his empire in terms of its rich agriculture. It also, these exotic animals show that he is pushing the realm of the empire out further into exotic lands in Africa and the East. And then crowning all of this up above, we have a very strange depiction of Jesus giving this blessing symbol and holding a cruciform staff, so we know that it is Jesus. We have these two angels flying in, and so this is kind of tying in that the ancient imagery that's important for establishing rule with the contemporary ideas about the new religion, about Christianity. So it's this really interesting piece that's kind of bringing in all these different sources that would be familiar and new to say that Justinian is the world conqueror, he is the new leader. So pretty interesting thing. Okay, now let's talk about this. This is maybe the most important work made in the Byzantine era. before I talk about that, let me tell you a little bit more about Justinian, just to kind of lead up to this, which is kind of his greatest cultural achievement. He did, so I told you about all the people that he was defeating and things in the military. He also is responsible for the codification of the Roman law that was called the Corpus Juris Civilis. So this is, it basically becomes the foundation of the laws of modern Europe. It's a really, really important document, so he has that under his belt as well. So Theodosius, who was the guy who succeeded Constantine, he made Christianity the official religion of the Byzantine Empire, but Justinian makes it the only legal religion. So I don't like that aspect so much. I'm kind of sad that my guy Justinian would do that. But he makes it the only legal religion, is this Orthodox Christianity, okay? So he also has some ideas about these ideas I told you about, the Arian perspective where the Father created Son, therefore they're not equal, those aspects of God, right? Or the monophysite, which means that Christ was only had one nature, he was only divine, not human. So he becomes interested in this idea of the equality of the three aspects, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Okay, so those are some cultural things. During his reign, he is the patron of 30 churches. That's a lot of building of these very complicated, large structures. And he really defined the Byzantine architectural style with his patronage. The most majestic and biggest and most famous and one of the more considered one of the more culturally important buildings in the world, which was constructed under the patronage of Justinian, is Hajiya Sophia, which is what this building is. You've probably seen it before. It's a pretty, it's quite famous. It's kind of one of the world wonders. It's a World Heritage Site. Hajiya Sophia means holy wisdom or holy knowledge, which I think is a pretty rad name. Let's look at a couple other pictures. Here's a nice picture. It's in Constantinople, so which is now Istanbul. Originally, when it was built, it didn't have these really thick fortifications on the outside, and it also didn't have the 4 minarets. What are minarets? Well, we'll talk about Islamic art in our next module, but a minaret is a tower that's used for the call to prayer in Islam. So this becomes a mosque after it's a church. Really stunning building, really fabulous. And the inside is incredible. So this is a shot of the inside. You'll notice that it has this large dome, and the dome is fenestrated. So the dome has windows all the way around the base, which is something that seems fairly structurally impossible, I think, to a lot of us. We're going to talk about that a little bit here. So this is a pretty fantastic building. We know who built it. We know the guys that Emperor Justinian hired to build it. They're Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus. And so they're mathematicians. They're mathematicians and physicists. So today they would probably be what we would call structural engineers. So they're architects, but they're also very good at math, which is important when you're building something like this. So this is built in 5 years, which is also amazing to me. It's built between 532 and 537. And one of the things that was important to them was this idea of a halo of light. So the idea that under this dome, you would have all of this light coming in. And one of the reasons that they were very interested in that was from this theologian named the Pseudo-Dionysius, and he said light comes from the good, and light is the visual image of God. And so this idea that letting light into a structure was a way to let God be seen in the structure. And this, again, it goes back to this idea of how Christ should be portrayed, and this idea that the Holy Spirit aspect should be portrayed in some way. This was kind of their answer to that. They also were very interested in the outside being kind of more plain and the inside being splendid, and light coming in again from these windows and the dome base. And then they had all this gold mosaic. They had all this gilded mosaic so that it would reflect the light around and bounce it all over and make it look really splendid. So to achieve this, to have this huge dome that has all these windows, because you know the windows weaken the structure, they had to invent some. They had to invent some things. So they invented a thing called the pendentive, which we're going to look at in a minute. But let me give you the measurements here too. This structure is 270 feet long by 240 feet wide, and the dome is 180 feet high, and the diameter of the dome is 108 feet across. So it's a huge, massive, heavy thing that they want to set on this base with all these windows. The huge exterior buttresses are added later, as are the minarets. So let's talk structurally a little bit about how they pulled this off. So first of all, we have this kind of basilica-like structure. It's a fairly singular kind of look at the time, where we have this big dome and then we have these half domes. This becomes kind of a Byzantine affiliated look. And they're able to do this because instead of putting a dome and a drum and then reinforcing the drum with what we call squinches to make it sit on the square base of the structure and kind of reinforce and make a thicker support, they create this thing, these things called pendentives. So you can see in the illustration over here. It's basically a curved triangle that comes up to support the dome and is able to take that heaviness from the dome above and push it down through those pediments, through those walls, instead of just relying on the drum itself to hold it up so that it can be perforated with all those windows. So it's a really brilliant solution to this design challenge that they had. And here's just another look at that dome, which is pretty fascinating. Fantastic. Okay, I will not talk about Hajiya Sophia anymore. We'll move on and talk about something else. So let's go back to Ravenna, one of my favorite places. So Ravenna in 493, Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king, chose Ravenna as the capital of his kingdom. In 539, Justinian's general Belisarius, who I mentioned earlier, captures it. For 2 centuries, it is the Eastern Empire's foothold in Italy. So it's kind of Justinian thinking, we need to get a hold back in the West so that we're not just in the East. We need to control part of what's going on in the West. So this is built there during Justinian's reign. This is San Vitale. So San Vitale is a central plan church. So we've looked at the central plans before that we have seen in St. Costanza in Rome. It is a fantastic building. I've been here and I love this building. I think it's incredible looking inside. The whole thing is mosaicked. It's very intricate in detail. It's kind of overwhelming. So in this apse mosaic, we have kind of a vaulted ceiling of the apse, and we have this depiction of the second coming of Christ. So we have Bishop Ecclesius to Christ's left, and he's offering him this model of the Church of San Vitale. So he's making this offering kind of for eternity in this mosaic. He was the bishop who was in charge of the commissioning of the church. And so he's offering this church to God, to Christ, which I think is kind of sweet. I don't know, something about him having the little model. And it makes us think of these funerary reliefs that we've seen in the past. Like if you think back to the Minoan art where they had the little boats and the bulls and things that they were giving in that funerary procession on the sarcophagus. So it's this idea of offering, and the offering being captured in art so that it's something that's continually done in place of the person even after their death. We have San Vitalis on the other side over here, and he is the patron saint of the church. And then we have Christ in the center, and he's sitting on this orb representing the universe to show his second coming. It's interesting because in the second coming, he's often depicted as the judge, right? So he sometimes looks quite stern. He almost always has a beard and looks fully mature. In this instance, he's quite young looking. He does not have a beard. So it's an interesting interpretation of that narrative. Then leading up on either side of the apse, we have 2 large mosaic panels depicting Justinian and Theodora. Theodora was his empress. So this is Justinian in the center in purple. Purple was the color associated with royalty. You'll notice that one of his guards is holding a shield. The shield has a Chi Rho, the symbol of Christ, on it. And then Justinian himself is holding a Eucharist platter. So this is in the Christian liturgy. You have communion, which is where you're taking bread and wine that are supposed to be the body and the blood of Christ. So this is the Eucharist platter that the bread for that ceremony would go on. Next to him, you have, what is his? Oh, it's in here. Maximanus, he was the bishop at the time. And so you have him portrayed next to Justinian. We have the priest holding the incense, one holding the jeweled Bible. Then on the other wall, we have Theodora. And so Theodora is holding the crater, the kind of chalice that the wine for the Eucharist ceremony would be in. And she's wearing a purple cloak as well, being the symbol of royalty. And on her cloak, it's hard to see in the slide, but you can see there's 3 men carrying gifts. Those are the Magi, the 3 kings who bring the gifts to the baby Jesus in the biblical story of the nativity scene. So that's kind of putting her in that role. Like, we are the patrons of the church. We bring gifts to the church to honor God. This is us honoring Christ, filling in kind of this role that the Magi filled, sort of making a parallel comparison there. The fountain with the holy water, is also there. And then you see her attendants behind her, all decked out in very elaborate clothing and jewelry. And about Theodora, she was Justinian's main advisor. And John, the Lydian, who he was a writer of the time, he was a historian of the time, and he described Theodora as surpassing the intelligence of all men who ever lived. So she was quite highly regarded as a political thinker and person herself, which is pretty interesting. So we have those images from Ravenna. This kind of style that's pretty typical of the Byzantine era, particularly in the early Byzantine, is not just in Ravenna, it's not just in Constantinople, it's throughout the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So this is an image of the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration is the word for Christ's transition from the physical into a spiritual being, okay? Transfiguration is also something associated with the rite of the Eucharist as well. And so this depiction is in the apse of the Church of the Virgin at the monastery of St. Catherine. This is on Mount Sinai in Egypt. Mount Sinai is, according to biblical text, where Moses went up to get the tablets with the 10 Commandments from God. So it's a holy site for Judeo-Christian religions. And it's interesting here because we see Christ portrayed as mature. He's also giving the blessing sign that we kind of affiliate with him. He's also, he has his beard and his long hair. He has his cruciform halo, but he also has this mandorla around him, which is this kind of almond-shaped thing. And this is often shown with him when he's being shown in the Transfiguration depiction. So, at this time, the Mount Sinai is the original monastery, so it's the first monastery. And during this period, icons, which we've talked about that word before, but icon in Greek just means images, but at this time, icon means something fairly specific. It's a small portable painting depicting Christ or the Virgin Mary or a saint or a combination of those kind of figures. And it's a small personal devotional item, right, that you could have in your home, that you could carry with you when you travel. Usually they're encaustic on wood, encaustic being a painting technique where the pigment is put in wax. Sometimes they're tempera paint on wood, which we've talked about as well. So these are really, really popular. Then in 627, it's the kind of rise of the Arabic forces coming into Europe and taking over some areas that were part of the Byzantine Empire. In fact, Byzantium loses 2/3 of its empire, so it loses a lot of its empire. This was a big shock, and it made Leo III, who was the emperor at the time, think that God was punishing him. So he thought God was punishing them for worshiping icons. So in 726, Leo III bans picturing the divine throughout the empire. And the reason for this thought is the second commandment, which is in Exodus in the Old Testament, which is thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. So the idea is Leo is kind of getting his ass kicked and decides that it's the reason he keeps failing is because God's mad at him for these icon worship, which there were a group of people called the iconoclasts, which translates literally to image breakers, who had this belief that this was bad, that it was blasphemous and they shouldn't be doing this. And so he decides to listen to them, and he bans portraying holy imagery. Okay, that leads us into the Middle Byzantine, which I will continue in the next lecture, where I'll talk about the Middle Byzantine and the Late Byzantine. All right, thanks guys.